patient who remembered everything. Memory care was a ward that operated on its own particular rhythm. It was slower than other parts of the hospital, more deliberate. The staff who worked there moved with a kind of careful unhurriedness that was not laziness but rather a learned understanding that rushing achieved nothing and often made things worse. Patients on memory care needed consistency above everything else. Familiar faces, familiar voices, familiar routines repeated with the same quiet reliability day after day. The staff became anchors for people whose minds were slowly losing their grip on the world. Ruth had worked memory care for 7 years. She understood her patients in the particular way that comes from spending hundreds of hours with people that the rest of the world had largely stopped trying to understand. She knew which patients became agitated in the late afternoon. She knew which ones responded to music and which ones responded to silence. She knew the difference between confusion that was distressing and confusion that was simply a different way of being present. She was good at her job in a way that went beyond training. The new patient arrived on a Monday morning in early October. His name was Franklin. He was 84 years old. His family had made the decision to move him to inpatient memory care after he had twice been found wandering outside his home in the middle of the night, once in January and once in March, both times in temperatures that could have killed him. His daughter signed the admission paperwork with the expression of a woman who had been grieving for a long time already. Franklin himself seemed unbothered by the transition. He was a tall man, still carrying the physical presence of someone who had once been powerfully built, and he settled into his room with a placid acceptance that Ruth recognized as either deep peace or deep confusion. In the early days, it was not always easy to tell the difference. She introduced herself on his first morning. He shook her hand and told her it was nice to meet her again. She assumed he had confused her with someone from his past. This happened frequently. She smiled and told him she was glad to be working with him. He looked at her steadily. He said he remembered her from the night before. Ruth told him gently that she had not been on shift the previous night. He nodded slowly and said he understood and turned to look out his window. Ruth made a note in his file and continued her rounds. The following morning he greeted her the same way. He remembered her from last night, he said. She had been standing in his doorway. She had not come in, but she had stood there for a long time looking at him. Ruth had not been in the building the previous night. She checked the overnight log to confirm this. She had not been on shift. No one by her description had been noted near his room. She sat with Franklin for a while that morning and talked with him about his life, his work, the city he had grown up in. He was lucid and warm and specific in his recollections, in the way that some memory care patients remained surprisingly sharp about the distant past, even as the recent past dissolved. She asked him about the woman he kept seeing in his doorway. He thought about this for a moment. He said it was not always her. Sometimes it was other people he recognized, people he had not seen in many years. He said they stood in the doorway the same way, not coming in, just looking at him with expressions he could not quite read. Sometimes he recognized them immediately. Sometimes the recognition came slowly, the way a name surfaces from deep water. Ruth asked him how he felt when he saw them. He said he did not feel frightened, if that was what she was asking. He said he felt the way you feel when you run into someone you lost track of long ago, a kind of complicated gladness. Ruth wrote up her notes carefully and flagged the observations for the attending physician to review. The physician noted it as a common feature of advanced memory familiar faces drawn from the depths of long-term memory, projected outward into the environment, entirely consistent with his diagnosis. Ruth accepted this explanation. She held it carefully for 3 more weeks. Then one evening near the end of October, she arrived for an early shift and found Franklin sitting in the chair by his window in an unusually settled state, hands folded in his lap, looking at the doorway. She asked him how he was. He said he was well, thank you. He said he had had a good night. She asked what had made it good. He said his brother had come to stand in the doorway. Ruth noted this and asked when he had last seen his brother. Franklin looked at her with clear, calm eyes. He said his brother had died in 1987. Ruth kept her expression steady. She asked how his brother had looked. Franklin thought about this. He said his brother had looked the same as always. He said he had looked healthy, happy even. He paused. Then he told Ruth one more thing. He said his brother had not been alone. There had been others standing behind him in the hallway, people Franklin recognized and people he did not. All of them still, all of them watching. He said the hallway behind his brother had been full of people. Ruth looked at the open doorway of his room. The corridor beyond was empty in the early morning quiet. She looked back at Franklin. He was still watching the doorway with that same expression of complicated gladness, as though the hallway was not empty at all, as though it was in fact quite crowded, and everyone in it had come specifically to see him. Franklin passed away 11 days later in his sleep. The overnight nurse who checked on him at 4 a.m. noted that he appeared to be sleeping peacefully. She also noted something she almost did not include in the official report, that when she had passed his doorway during rounds, she had paused because something about the room felt different, warmer than usual, fuller somehow, as though the room that had held one quiet, sleeping man was not quite as empty as it appeared. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then moved on. She did not know what she had felt standing there, but she did not feel it was her place to be afraid of it. The ambulance that came back, the emergency bay at Rowan Park Hospital, was never completely still. Even at 3 a.m, there was always some level of activity, an ambulance pulling in, a patient being transferred, staff moving between the bay and the department doors with the focused efficiency that emergency medicine demanded around the clock. Callum had worked emergency dispatch and bay coordination for 9 years. He had seen almost everything a person could see in that role. He was not easily surprised, and he was not easily rattled, and he prided himself on both of these qualities in the quiet way of someone who had earned them through experience rather than simply claiming them. The night of the 14th of April started as an ordinary night. 2 ambulances came in before midnight, a cardiac event and a fall resulting in a suspected fracture. Both patients were transferred to the department efficiently, and both crews cleared the bay and returned to service without incident. At 1:20 a.m, the bay was empty. Callum was at his coordination desk reviewing the roster for the following shift when the bay doors opened. An ambulance pulled in. This was not unusual. He looked up at the monitor showing the bay feed and noted the vehicle pulling into the second bay position. He looked at his dispatch screen. No incoming unit was logged. He checked again. No active calls in the area. No units showing as en route to Rowan Park. He picked up his radio and called the incoming crew to identify themselves and their patient. Static. He tried again. Nothing. He watched the monitor. The ambulance sat in the bay with its engine running. The rear doors remained closed. No crew members emerged from the front. Callum put on his jacket and walked out to the bay. The ambulance was a model he recognized, standard configuration. The markings were correct. The vehicle number was painted on the side in the regulation position. He walked around to the driver's side and looked in through the window. The cab was empty. Engine running, lights on, no one in the driver's seat. He tried the driver's door, locked. He walked to the passenger side, locked. He stood at the rear doors of the ambulance. He could hear something from inside, a monitor, the distinctive sound of a cardiac monitor running inside the vehicle. A steady, rhythmic beeping. He tried the rear door handle. It opened. The interior of the ambulance was fully set up. Gurney in position, equipment in place. The cardiac monitor on the side panel was running and displaying a steady rhythm. The gurney was not empty, there was a patient on it. An older man, completely still, eyes closed, with a full set of monitoring leads attached and the IV line running. He appeared to be breathing. Callum immediately called for a medical team from the department. They came out within 2 minutes, and the patient was transferred into the emergency department efficiently and with complete professionalism. Then one of the nurses asked Callum which crew had brought him in. Callum said he did not know. She gave him a look and went back inside. He stood in the bay beside the empty ambulance. He ran the vehicle number through the system. The number came back as belonging to a unit that had been decommissioned 4 years earlier following an accident. The vehicle had been written off. It no longer existed in the active fleet. Callum walked back to the ambulance and stood beside it. The engine was no longer running. The lights were off. He tried the rear doors again. They were locked. He looked through the small window in the rear door. The interior was dark and empty. No monitor, no gurney, no equipment of any kind. Just the bare metal interior of a vehicle that had been stripped before decommissioning. He stood in the empty bay for a long time. Then he went inside and found the team working on the patient who had been brought in. The attending physician told him the man was stable, elderly, some cardiac irregularity, but responding well. He asked Callum again about the crew who had brought him in. Callum said there had been no crew. The physician stared at him. Callum asked if the patient had been identified. The physician handed him the small card that had been found in the patient's shirt pocket, a standard medical information card. Name, date of birth, blood type, emergency contact. Callum looked at the emergency contact line. The name and number listed there were his own. His name, his mobile number, written in handwriting he did not recognize on a card belonging to a man he had never seen before in his life. He looked up at the physician. The physician was watching him carefully. Callum put the card in his pocket. He went back to his coordination desk. He sat down. He looked at the bay monitor. The second bay was empty. The overnight light reflected off the wet concrete where the ambulance had stood. He picked up his phone and called the number listed as the emergency contact on the card. His own mobile rang in his hand. He looked at the screen. The incoming call was from his own number. He answered it. The line was completely silent for a long moment. Then a sound came through. Faint, distant. The sound of a cardiac monitor, steady and slow and rhythmic. And then the call ended. Callum sat in the coordination bay of Rowan Park Hospital until the sun came up and the day shift arrived and the building filled with noise and movement and all the ordinary business of a working day. He never found an explanation. He never stopped looking for one either. But on quiet nights, when the bay was empty and the clock moved slowly toward 2 in the morning, he always found himself watching the second bay position a little more carefully than the others, just in case. The hospital that remembered its dead. Belmarsh General had been built in 1931. It had been expanded 4 times since then, each expansion adding new wings and new floors and new departments until the original structure was almost entirely surrounded and absorbed by the newer building. If you walked the oldest section of the hospital, the original East Wing, you could see where the old walls met the new ones, a subtle shift in the color and texture of the plaster, a slight unevenness in the floor where the foundations had settled differently over decades. The oldest section of Belmarsh was used primarily for administrative offices now. Most of the clinical work happened in the newer wings, but one department remained in the original East Wing by necessity rather than choice: the records room. Decades of patient files, thousands and thousands of documents stretching back to the earliest days of the hospital's operation. There had been talk for years of digitizing everything, but the project was enormous and the funding was uncertain, and so the paper records remained where they had always been, floor to ceiling, in a series of rooms that occupied the deepest part of the old East Wing. James had been assigned to the records room for one reason only. He was new. The records digitization project had finally received its funding, and James, freshly hired and lowest in the administrative hierarchy, was tasked with beginning the process of scanning and cataloguing the oldest files. He did not mind the work. It was quiet and methodical, and he was a person who found quiet, methodical work genuinely satisfying. He began with the oldest section, files dating back to the 1930s and 40s, patient names and dates and diagnoses written in the careful handwriting of physicians who had been dead for 50 years. The first week passed without incident. The second week, he began to notice something strange. He first attributed it to the age of the building and dismissed it entirely. The sounds old buildings made were well documented and entirely explicable: settling foundations, contracting pipes, air moving through ductwork that had not been properly maintained since the original construction. But the sound he kept hearing was not a creak or a groan or a metallic ping. It was footsteps, coming from the room directly adjacent to the one he was working in. He checked the adjacent room on his first day of hearing it. Empty shelves, a single bare bulb, no one there. He checked it again the second time. Same result. By the end of the second week, he had stopped checking. He simply worked through the sound of footsteps moving back and forth in the empty room beside him and told himself it was the building. Then the files started changing. This was harder to explain away. He was working through a particular drawer of records from 1943 when he pulled out a file he was certain he had already scanned. He recognized the patient name. He recognized the distinctive loop in the physician's handwriting. He had scanned this file 2 days earlier and placed it in the completed stack. It was back in the original drawer. He checked the completed stack. The file was not there. He scanned it again and placed it carefully in the completed stack and weighted it down with a heavy binder. The following morning, the file was back in the original drawer. James sat at his work table for a long time without moving. Then he began paying closer attention to the files he was processing. He noticed that certain files appeared more worn than others, not the general wear of age and storage, specific wear, the kind that came from being handled repeatedly, pages soft at the edges from many fingers, covers slightly bowed from being opened and closed many times. He began pulling these files and reading them more carefully. They were not connected by diagnosis, not connected by physician, not connected by year, but they were connected by one thing. Every patient in the well-worn files had died in the hospital, not recovered and discharged, died inside the building, some from illness, some from injury, some from causes that the 1940s terminology made difficult to interpret precisely, but all of them had died here. James sat with this information for several days. He continued his work. He continued hearing the footsteps in the adjacent room. He continued finding certain files back in their original drawers after he had scanned and moved them. Then, one afternoon, he pulled a file from the very back of the oldest drawer and felt the hair on his arms rise. The file was for a patient admitted in November of 1938. The name on the file was his grandmother's name. His grandmother, who he knew had grown up in this city. His grandmother, who had mentioned once, only once, in passing, that she had spent time in a hospital as a young woman. His grandmother, who had never spoken about it again and who had died when James was 12, taking whatever the story was with her. His hands were not entirely steady as he opened the file. The records inside were sparse: an admission date, a few clinical notes in that careful dated handwriting, a discharge date 3 weeks after admission. She had survived whatever had brought her there, but tucked inside the back cover of the file, folded once and slightly yellowed, was something that had no business being in a clinical record. A single piece of paper, a note handwritten in his grandmother's handwriting. He recognized it immediately from the birthday cards she had sent him every year until she died. He unfolded it carefully. It said only this: "If anyone finds this, please know that this place remembers us, all of us who were here. It keeps something of everyone who passes through. I don't know what to call it. I only know that I felt it, and that it is not unkind. It is simply unable to let go." James sat in the records room of Belmarsh General for a very long time. The footsteps in the adjacent room had stopped. The building was completely quiet around him, and James had the sudden, overwhelming sense that the quiet was not emptiness, that it was, in fact, the opposite of emptiness, that the building was full in ways that had nothing to do with the people currently walking its halls, and that it had been full for a very long time. He refolded the note, he placed it back inside the file, he closed the drawer, and he sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a very old building that has seen too much to ever be truly empty again.